Our World Whisky collection brings a selection of whiskies from around the globe into a neatly packaged box. We'll be starting our journey in Ireland, where whisky is said to have originated. Our award-winning 8-year-old single malt from an undisclosed distillery was awarded gold at the Irish Whisky Masters. We'll then head over to the USA for our second with a 9-year-old American whisky from the Heaven Hill Distillery in Kentucky. It's back across the pond and deep into the Bavarian countryside for an award-winning German 3-year-old single malt. Our Slyrs was awarded gold at the World Whisky Masters. We'll finish up in Blighty with another award-winning whisky. Our 8-year-old single malt from the English Whisky Company was also awarded gold at the World Whisky Masters. No travel involved, but we've transported you from Ireland, Kentucky, Bavaria and Norfolk via miniatures. My preferred tasting order for this pack is as follows: Irish single malt whisky, Heaven Hill American whisky, Slyrs Bavarian single malt whisky, and finish up with the English Whisky Company single malt. This 8-year-old single malt from an undisclosed Irish distillery is our second batch, a release of just 876 bottles at 45.7% ABV. It's one of our award-winning whiskies, being awarded gold at the Irish Whisky Masters, a competition run by the Spirits Business magazine. Now, if you know your Irish whisky history, then you should be able to close down on the distilleries this could come from. It is a single malt, so that rules out Ireland's largest distillery, Middleton, as they don't make single malt commercially. For centuries, Ireland maintained its supremacy, only yielding to Scotland at the end of the 19th century. Ireland's whisky dominance started to slip towards the end of the 19th century, the coffee still being one of the initial factors of this decline. The Anglo-Irish War of Independence was the next nail in the coffin, which was promptly followed by Prohibition in the States. The combination of Great Britain cutting off its biggest customer base, the Commonwealth, and the American Prohibition being their second biggest customer, almost put an end to their glorious history. By the late 1970s, just 2 Irish whisky distilleries existed: Bushmills in County Antrim, Northern Ireland, and the new Middleton, a brand new distillery built by what was left of the Dublin powerhouses. It wasn't until 1987 that a new independent distillery was founded. John Teeling must be considered as one of the founding fathers of the rebirth of the Irish whisky industry when he opened the Cooley Distillery. The Cooley Distillery makes both grain and single malt whisky, but unlike its Northern Irish neighbour, it only double distills its malt, much like most of Scotland. Our label is basically an impossible trident, also known as an impossible fork, a blivet, a poyot, devil's tuning fork. It's a drawing of an impossible object, an undecipherable figure, a kind of optical illusion. It appears to have 3 cylindrical prongs at one end, which then mysteriously transform into 2 rectangular prongs at the other end. On the label you can see the spirit safe of an Irish whisky distillery, except, wait, how does that even work? It looks like there's 3 pipes, but there's actually 2. Then there's 3 again if you look closely. But if you look even more closely, there's only 2. We're confused. Help. Up until 1987, all Irish whisky was triple distilled. A clue, perhaps? This is our first batch of American whisky from the Heaven Hill Distillery. We have released a bourbon and a corn whisky from Heaven Hill, both American whiskies, but this is the first American whisky. Confusing? Perhaps, but let me explain. It's a 9-year-old, a release of just 1,177 bottles at 48.4% ABV. Now, the Heaven Hill Distillery was founded in 1935. Prohibition ending in 1933 sparked new interest in Kentucky bourbon. In Bardstown, founder Ed Shapira and his brothers agreed to invest in a new distillery, and eventually bought it outright. They had no inventory, no warehousing, and no brand at that time. The distillery has been family owned and operated ever since, and today the distillery is known for many brands: Heaven Hill, Bernheim Original, Rittenhouse Rye, Elijah Craig, Evan Williams, Pikesville, Larceny Bourbon, Old Fitzgerald, and Mellow Corn. The broad category of American whiskey is a big tent, with few specific requirements for production under this general term. By design, the regulations are not overly prescriptive. American whiskey comes in many forms. Bourbon, the most recognised type of American whiskey, can be produced only in the United States. But contrary to popular belief, does not have to be produced in Kentucky, although most of it is. Specific categories of whiskey have more exacting requirements, whereas this has very few, as it's neither a bourbon, rye, or a wheat whiskey. It's followed the bourbon rules up until after distilling. But then instead of charred virgin oak casks, used casks have been used to mature, much like the majority of Scotch whisky. Heaven Hill's production plant suffered a massive fire in 1996, many barrels of whisky going up in flames. Since then, they have installed a sprinkler system in the warehouses, which you can see on our Heaven Hill label. We've used this label for all three variants, with subtle and not so subtle changes to differentiate between the bourbon, the corn, and the American whiskies. Just how many Americanism objects have we piled up and scattered across the floor here? This is our first batch from the Bavarian distillery, Slyrs. It's a 3-year-old, a release of just 691 bottles at 52.5% ABV. This is another one of our award-winning releases, picking up a gold medal at the Spirits Business World Whisky Masters. The Slyrs distillery is located on the shores of Lake Schliersee in Bavaria, Germany. This region has Iro-Scottish roots, Slyrs being Gaelic. In the year 779, 5 monks from Ireland and Scotland built a monastery in the Bavarian wilderness of Schliersee. They called the monastery Slyrs. The Slyrs whisky story, however, begins a little later, with a bet made back in 1994. Following his visits to Scotland, brewer and master distiller Florian Stetter bet his colleagues a crate of wheat beer that first-class whisky could also be distilled in Upper Bavaria. Just a short while later, Florian starts making whisky at his parents' Lanternhammer distillery. The first Slyrs whisky was distilled in 1999. In 2007, a dedicated whisky distillery was built nearby. Production and cask aging all takes place at the distillery site, giving Slyrs a thoroughly regional Upper Bavarian character. Whisky is made using Bavarian, 2-row barley, and alpine spring water from the Schliersee Mountains. After careful malting in a special malt house, it is gently dried. This gives Slyrs its typical aromatic, smoky flavour. When you think of Bavaria, whisky isn't the first thought that comes to your head, eh? It's beer. So our label features a scene from a Bavarian beer festival in October, or Oktoberfest if you will. That's head distiller Hans balancing a big load of half-full whisky glasses in his arms, and the punter with a bottle of this bottling asking him the question, "Bist du der whisky mixer?" is someone we know. This is an 8-year-old English whisky. It's our second batch from the English Whisky Company's distillery in Norfolk, a release of just 845 bottles at 52.3% ABV. It's yet another of our award-winning whiskies being awarded gold at the World Whisky Masters. The distillery, aptly named St George's Distillery, is the first to be built in England for over 100 years. The English Whisky Company has led the new wave of English whisky makers, releasing the first English single malt for more than 100 years in 2009. Founder James Nelstrop always had an interest in whisky, but it wasn't until he turned 60 that he and his son, Andrew, decided to pursue this dream. Some of the best barley is grown in Norfolk, and the Brackland water is superb. After a great deal of research, a planning application was submitted and approval was granted in January 2006. Renowned ex-Lefroy distiller Ian Henderson was talked out of retirement and helped the new distillery to get going. In December 2006, the first 29 barrels were filled with new make spirit, and 3 years later, at the end of 2009, the first English whisky in over a century was released. Our label features the epic struggle between St George and the dragon, as experienced from within the plucky George's helmet. What we can see is what the dragon is guarding, Why, that armoured fellow isn't freeing a maiden, he's after the gold. The golden whisky, that is. So that's a little bit of boutique. I hope you've enjoyed your introduction with our World Whisky collection. If you fancy some bigger bottles, then you can find the 50 centilitre version of these 5 centilitre miniatures to purchase online or at your favourite specialist drinks retailer. Plus, there's even more boutique whiskies for you to discover. Don't say we didn't warn you. For further news, check out our website, thatboutiquewhiskycompany.com. Follow us on social media, @BoutiqueWhisky. If you want to hear more from me, check out our podcast by searching Uncorked Whisky Sessions on Spotify, Apple Podcast and Amazon. Or actually anywhere a podcast could be. We should be there. Right? My work here is done and I'm off on my holidays. I've been Boutique Dave and this is my World Whisky Blend Highball. Cheers. Oh, that's good.